Welcome to tonight's lecture, Light and Dark, A Little History of the Negative by Geoffrey Batchen. We're thrilled to have you at the Art Gallery here tonight, and my name is Isabel Parker-Phillip and I'm the curator of photographs here. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which the gallery stands, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's my special privilege to be able to welcome Geoffrey Batchen once again to the Art Gallery of New South Wales to present this lecture aligned with the launch of his new book. And I'd like to welcome the team from Power Publications, Mark Ledbury, Marnie Williams, Katie Uclea, and the rest of their team and just thank them for all the hard work they do and to acknowledge that we have a long history of working with the Power Institute and a deep respect for that institute and the University of Sydney more broadly, and are always happy to support Power Publications. Yeah, they do wonderful, wonderful things. And after the lecture, I want to invite all of you to come and join us for the launch of Jeff's book, which will take place one level up in the function space at the end of the entrance court. So as soon as the lecture's finished, we'll all move as a cohort. Geoff has a really long history of working with the Art Gallery, and he's a very old friend of the Art Gallery. He's presented innumerable lectures and symposiums. He's run workshops for artists and other curatorial colleagues, and he's always been willing to take my phone calls even when I ignore the time difference between New Zealand and Australia. He's been a wonderful colleague, and it's been incredible to have him in this part of the world. And he's been, something of a mentor for me. The first time I met Geoff, which was through a symposium that we ran many years ago now, I was just an intern. And so through my time at the Art Gallery, it's been invaluable to have Geoff as a support. And before he moves on to a new chapter in his professional career, it's wonderful to be able to mark this occasion and to celebrate the important role that he's played for Australia and this part of the world more broadly in the realm of photographic history. And so it's a wonderful occasion, and I'm so thrilled that we can be the host venue and the partner with Power to celebrate the launch of your book, but also to get to hear new bits of research too. So without further ado, I just want to welcome Mark Ledbury, who's the director of the Power Institute, to formally welcome Geoff. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isabel, and good evening. And I'd like to thank everyone at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, particularly Isabel and Alex, Greg, and all the public programs team for making this event possible, and for their continuing partnership with many projects. And I also want to thank, of course, tonight the brilliant Marnie Williams for everything she does for this and all of our publications, and her team, which includes Toby Fitch and Kate Uclea and Susan Thomas at the Power. And indeed, I would like to thank John Schaefer and all of those supporters of 19th century art and culture at the University of Sydney and beyond, including in this gallery, who have also helped in various ways make this event possible. A reminder too to everyone that Geoff and this are the stars of the show, and that after tonight's lecture, and which will be a talk and then a brief Q&A, so please have your questions ready, and Geoff will take some questions. We will all move, hopefully, via the gift shop, where you can buy a copy of this. So what you do is you go up the stairs, and you will not miss the store where the book is on sale, and then you can take the long walk to the other end of the gallery, up the ramp, and that's where the celebration will be held. Okay. It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Geoffrey Batchen, who's, I think, extremely well known to many people in this audience already. But in a way, I still want to introduce him because of his significance to the world of photography, history and theory, not just in this region, but worldwide. His work is very capacious and focuses on the capaciousness and resonance of photography in modern life, as it interacts with big issues: war, society, memory, technology, commerce, and sex. And as he puts in his book, photography, theory, and history liberated from the sort of enslavement of the photograph. In other words, photography beyond the photograph as object. Jeff's impressive body of work has been widely read and translated over several decades, and he really is one of the world's leading interpreters of photography and how it might and can work. He's the author of, and many of you know this already, Burning with Desire, The Conception of Photography, 1997. I'm just going to give you highlights too. Each Wild Idea, Writing Photography in History, 2001. Forget Me Not, Photography and Remembrance, 2004. William Henry Fox Talbot, 2008. What of Shoes, Van Gogh and Art History, 2009. Suspending Time, Life, Photography and Death of 2010. Emanations, The Art of the Cameraless Photograph, a groundbreaking work from 2016. It's a breathless list. And of course, the present book, Apparitions, Photography and Dissemination, a version of which came out in Czech, and we thank our Czech colleagues at NAMU, especially Jan Heller, but which is published in full in a slightly different version by Power, and which, of course, we're launching tonight. And as if this all weren't enough, he's the editor of very profoundly influential collections, such as Photography Degree Zero, Reflections on Barta Camera Lucida, The Picturing Atrocity, Photography in Crisis, and many other articles in essays, journals, and books. And it's his combination of historical acuity and depth, archival interest, and often producing, as this book does, very fascinating objects, and deep theoretical meditation, that really marks out a major body of scholarship. And the present book, I have to say, is a demonstration of this, engaging with the Great Exhibition, with casting, with technologies of reproduction, with the complex web of cultural and aesthetic debates that photography encompassed, and within which it was enmeshed. I'm also very proud to say, of course, about his career that his BA and PhD were both at the University of Sydney, and we were reminiscing about his fundamental role, even at the Power Institute, as an organizer of events. And his teaching career has taken him from New York to New Zealand, as you all know, and he's just left his professorship of the Victoria University of Wellington to take up the very prestigious Professorship of Art History at the University of Oxford, a post that will allow his commitment to excellence in teaching and research and exhibition making, we hope, to shape a new generation of historians of art, technology, and of culture more generally. So it's absolute pleasure to have him here speaking tonight and to be able to launch his book. The title of his talk is, as you can see, Light and Dark, A Little History of the Negative. Please welcome Geoffrey Batchen.
Well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I could listen to Isabel and Mark all night. I could just sit down and let them, keep going. And certainly make it sound like I've clogged up the world with a lot of useless talk about photography. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to give this talk, and I'm grateful to all of the people that have been mentioned, particularly Marnie, who put hours of work into getting this latest book out. We could tell you all sorts of horror stories about collaborating with other presses and the complications that occur when you're having to work across huge time zones and language differences and things like that. But her commitment and Mark's encouragement and support made this book possible. So I'm very grateful to them. And of course, I'm always grateful for my collaboration with Isabel, who even as an intern was an outstanding dinner companion, and I was aware that she was going to have a great career from the first moment that I met her. And of course, she continues to be an important part of the gallery here. I've been very lucky because I think at least twice Judy Annear, when she was curator of photography, invited me to speak here at the Art Gallery at one of those annual conference type things she organised, and I twice gave papers that eventually have turned into this book. So I thought that rather than reiterate things that some of you may well have heard then, that I would treat you to a fragment of my next book, which is due out next year through another press that we won't even mention, but no doubt you'll keep your eyes open for it and eventually it may appear. So why don't we do that? A photographer glances down at his watch. Time is on his mind. In his right hand, held high, is a glass negative in a wooden frame. The gesture conveniently reveals that he has previously captured two people posing for a portrait, a standing man and a seated woman. Visible only in reverse tones, these people look as if they'd been X-rayed rather than photographed. The year is 1948, and the man holding the negative is Maiola Amici, a photographer working in a town near Stanleyville in the Belgian Congo. He has been photographed by Lennart Nilsson, a Swedish photojournalist, for a story that eventually appeared in Life magazine. Behind the negative Amici is holding, unseen by us, is a piece of light-sensitive photographic paper. For this photographer is being shown at work in his darkroom, printing a photograph by pressing a negative tightly against the paper in the frame and exposing both to the glow of his kerosene lamp. We are, it seems, witnessing a key moment in the coming into being of a photograph, the dramatic moment of that photograph's birth. It's always difficult to know where to begin any history of photography, but the darkroom, the site of this particular primal scene, seems as good a place as any. This is where negative and positive always used to be brought together under a red glow to consummate the photographic act, recreating in a careful orchestration of light and dark an inverted version of the relationship that has already taken place outside in the back of a camera. William Henry Fox Talbot described photography in terms of a relationship of negative and positive images as early as 1835, making it central to his conception of photogenic drawing and to his own practice. As he wrote in his notebook, "If the paper is transparent, the first drawing may serve as an object to produce a second drawing in which the lights would be reversed." Right from the start, then, Talbot flags many of those issues that complicate any study of the role of the negative within photography. The negative, along with positive, the word was first proposed by John Herschel in February of 1840, is a transparent object that is subject to reversal. Once reversed, each piece of paper becomes the other of its mate. Thus, the interactive, interdependent relationship of negative and positive ensures that photography has a distinctively binary identity, with all the complexities this brings in its wake. One of those complexities is that some photographs are negatives even when they aren't. As Larry Schaff has pointed out, and I quote, "An important point that must be kept in mind is that, from a physical-chemical point of view, there is no essential difference between a negative and a positive in Talbot's work. The latter is merely a negative of a negative," unquote. Herschel's naming of the negative as a distinctive entity, however, insists on dividing photography into two, insists on an essential difference between one and its other, even when there is none. And the very language used to make that division, negative and positive, is of course rhetorically infused with prejudice. The distinction between them therefore comes with a disparity in value. It represents a political as well as a technical hierarchy. Of course, photography's duality is almost always but a prelude to a devolution into one plus many. For negatives are usually unique, whereas photographic prints are often multiples, being frequently produced as a number of replicas or near replicas of each other. As Walter Benjamin once put it, from a photographic negative one can make any number of prints, so to ask for the authentic print makes no sense. Indeed, as technologies have improved, it's often impossible to tell which print came first, original and copy being identical in appearance. These prints are each made from the same negative, but they are also copies made strange, faithful to the negative's relative disposition of tones, even while looking nothing like it. One consequence is that all photographs suffer from some sort of multiple personality disorder. After all, photographs necessarily begin from a split identity, with any positive print dependent on, but separated from, the negative which begat it. But that print is then split again into a number of identical siblings, with copies of it sometimes being churned out in the thousands, or today even in the millions. For this reason, a photographic print is never present in and of itself. It is, instead, always just one part of a chain to which it refers even when no other part is present. Any single print is the tip of an otherwise invisible iceberg of activity. These reflections point us to a troubling but crucial question. What exactly is a photograph? Is it just the negative, that original indexical trace of the world being depicted? Or is it a single positive master print generated from that negative? Or does a photograph necessarily comprise the two of them together, negative and positive symbiotically joined in eternal union? But the questions don't end there. Could the photograph in fact be a more virtual entity again, the image created by an individual photographer in the back of his or her mind's eye at the moment before or even sometime after the exposure of a negative? You can see the problem I'm posing. when exactly does a photograph begin or end? To focus on the role of the negative is necessarily to raise such questions, and therefore to consider in critical terms the nature of photography's mode of being in the world. Unfortunately, both art museums and histories of photography tend to overlook negatives. But then, so do all of us. We look at negatives, or rather beyond them to what they could become. We hold them to the light in order to see them the better, and then use them to make something else. They exist for us in the present only as utilitarian tools, redolent with potential, remaining incomplete entities until and unless their tones are reversed through a process of printing. By contrast, photographic prints are assumed to be entirely whole and complete, an end product in and of themselves. We treat those prints as images rather than objects. Against all logic, given their opacity, we presume to look through the print with the light behind us, as if it offers us a window onto some past moment and into some other world. A photographer like Henri Cartier-Bresson, assuming for a moment he actually made the print you've seen, usually would have begun the printing process itself by putting the negative into an enlarger and making a series of test strips. Dictated partly by the need for trial and error and partly by a preconception based on experience, these experiments with the negative are designed to fail, or at least to allow a sequence of contrasting juxtapositions of success and failure on a single piece of photographic paper. Here in the darkroom, then, a photograph is imagined before it is made, prompted by the look of these strips of sequentially exposed paper, these failed versions of a future photograph. As failures, test strips are usually regarded as no more than ephemera and are generally discarded after use. But not always. Here are two sets of examples from across photography's history, one set made by John Herschel in 1841 and the other by the Australian artist Justine Varga in 2017. They demonstrate that the darkroom is a laboratory where photographs are produced, but also tested, notated, transformed, rejected, reprinted, found wanting, and often destroyed. It's a place, in other words, where the ruined photograph is a commonplace, where the ruin comes first, where a photograph is ruined many times before it is declared whole and ready for public exposure. It would be interesting to attempt a history of the test strip, of those pieces of photograph judged to be necessary but incomplete, to be not quite photographs because they are nothing but photographs, because they signify nothing but themselves. In the 19th century, negatives were valued as evidence of technical prowess, and unlike today, they were often displayed in exhibitions, along with prints made from them. This encouraged their close inspection and assessment. And such an inspection is indeed instructive, for there are many differences between one negative and the next. As we've seen, Henri Cartier-Bresson managed to capture a surreal moment by using his Leica to record on its 35mm roll film that exact second in which a striding silhouetted figure appears to be suspended above a sheet of reflective water, magically mimicking the pose seen on the posters behind that figure. But film negatives were made in different sizes and proportions throughout the 20th century, depending on the camera used and the needs of the photographer. Photographers like Edward Weston, who wanted to produce a deep range of tonal values in his prints, employed a relatively large negative in the back of an 8x10-inch folding bed view camera. This enabled him to capture as much visual information as possible in each exposure, which, in the case of his photographs of vegetables, could be as long as 4.5 hours in duration. Inspired by a meeting with Alfred Stieglitz in 1921, Weston came to emphasize the need for a technically superb negative and a sharp, clear print, unsullied by darkroom manipulations, so-called straight or pure photography. This purity was based on the assumption that a photograph cannot, as Weston put it, survive corrective handiwork. Except, of course, that many photographs have indeed survived such handiwork and perhaps even have prospered from it. Eugene Pio, working in Italy in the early 1850s, used pieces of red paper to mask the skies in his negatives and thereby ensure both an evenly toned print and sharp edges for any buildings that are featured, edges that the photographer could reshape with his added paper during the process. He also retouched this negative with gouache on its reverse side. The negative thereby became a kind of textured collage object, a combination of translucent and opaque papers, but also of depth and flatness, paint and photograph, realism, and abstraction. The English photographer John Murray produced hundreds of paper negatives, most exposed in the 1850s while he was stationed in India. In a paper negative, the image is right in the paper, embedded in its fibres. Although Murray used paper specially manufactured for the use of photographers, the textures of the paper fibres still remained a problem, resulting in an uneven tone in any of his positive prints. He therefore typically waxed his negatives before exposure and then painted their skies with black ink or paint after development to ensure a clear, creamy expanse in any positive print. He also used a yellow dye or bleach to colour in some of the shadow areas and help to bring out the details. Julia Margaret Cameron was another inveterate experimenter, in her case with wet collodion glass plate negatives. She was notorious for leaving fingerprints and other imperfections in the albumin surface of the finished photograph, or even in the collodion on the negatives themselves. But she also sometimes deliberately scratched her negatives, as here, to leave a halo inscribed over the head of her subject, or smoked the back of a negative to produce the appearance of diaphanous clouds in the finished print. And at least three times she printed her negatives in reverse, flipping the glass over, to produce a more diffuse version of the final image. Of course, we could spend a whole lecture looking at various instances of the enhancement or manipulation of negatives, including at those photographs made by combining two or more of them. The Australian photographer Frank Hurley was initially forbidden from making combination prints from his photographs taken on the battlefields of the First World War. But eventually he was given permission to make 6 mural-sized prints, as long as they were clearly labelled as having been made from multiple negatives. But people, of course, see what they want to see. Morning After the Battle of Passchendaele, composed from negatives made in 1917, was described by one reviewer as taken under machine gun fire, despite it having been created from several different negatives, including one of a magnificently moody sky, made all the more so by having had its clouds darkened during the printing process, and by the sunbeams that Hurley added himself. Hurley called such images photographic impression pictures, a term borrowed from the pictorialist rhetoric of camera clubs. Here's another one, The Raid, composed from 12 separate negatives. Fictional though these scenes may be, many contemporary observers claim that a viewing of them, and I quote, stirs the imagination to a perhaps more intimate realisation of what prodigies of devotion and sacrifice those shell-swept trenches of Flanders witnessed, unquote. In other words, fictitious photographs can sometimes convey a truth that truthful ones cannot. Do you need some water? Okay. Don't die on us. In any case, yeah. In any case, it doesn't get us very far to condemn such photographs for being deceptive or to denounce them as fakes. As no less a figure than Edward Steichen wrote in 1903, every photograph is a fake from start to finish, a purely impersonal, unmanipulated photograph being practically impossible. No, the question should not be about whether a photograph has been manipulated. It should be about how and to what end that manipulation has taken place. Consider a series of 6 photographic images depicting the world's oceans, released by the German artist Andreas Gursky in 2010. Using numerous digital files derived from high-definition satellite imagery, Gursky has again produced composite prints from multiple matrices. In this case, the end result is a set of panoramic views of those parts of the world usually given short thrift, those spaces between land masses that give that land definition, the absence that makes their presence visible. Huge in scale, but with no particular focal point, these are photographs that seek to immerse us in that absence, to absorb us into it and it into us. Ocean 3, for example, features an extraterrestrial view of the Pacific, framed by the edges of Australia on one side and the Americas on the other. The blue expanse between these continents is occasionally dotted with islands, most of them tiny, but for the 2 major islands that make up New Zealand. This expanse has been digitally inflected with variable depths and stretched out of shape to fit a rectangular format. Contrived though they are, these are photographs of what we could call negative space. Gursky thereby makes visible that which is usually invisible, the ocean within us, as Tongan scholar Epeli Hauofa once put it, the otherness that makes any identity whatsoever possible, including both photographies and our own. Negative space is like the photographic negative. It's usually that which goes unseen or unacknowledged. But sometimes photographers have chosen to reverse the usual order of things and make the unseen visible. In 1929, for example, Maurice Tabar decided to combine negative and positive versions of an image in the same picture, as if to confront us with photography's own irremediably split personality. An equally disquieting effect could be achieved by briefly exposing a negative or print to light during its development in the darkroom. A solarizing technique first described by Armand Sabatier in 1862, the end result, although unpredictable, often looks as though negative and positive have been layered over one another. This accentuates forms with a dark outline that marks the transition between reversed and non-reversed areas of the photograph. As Rosalind Krauss has written, such techniques establish, as she puts it, a kind of testimony to a cloven reality, but also enact a doubling in which negative and positive versions of a photograph are encountered simultaneously. This doubling, she suggests, and I quote, opens the original to the effects of difference, of deferral, of one thing after another, or within another, of multiples burgeoning within the same. In the case of Man Ray's Noir et Blanche, this multiplication effect is grounded in questions of racial and sexual difference, explicitly linking photography's peculiar characteristics as a medium to these larger dispositions of power. The image first appeared in the pages of the French edition of Vogue magazine in May of 1926, accompanied by the words, in translation, "Mother of pearl face and ebony mask," along with an elusive text, almost certainly not written by the photographer, that associated women with what the text called primitive nature. The title it now goes by, with its stark contrast of black and white, was not used by Man Ray. Noir et Blanche first appeared with the photograph only when it was printed in the Belgian journal Varietés in July of 1928. Much has been written about the possible meanings of the photograph's composition. It consists of a peculiar kind of still life, featuring the disembodied head of Man Ray's partner, Alice Prynne, known by her stage name of Kiki de Montparnasse. Kiki's eyes are closed, she is temporarily made blind, and she rests on a pool of blackness created by the casting of her own shadow. Her face is as sleekly styled as a minimal Brancusi sculpture. Or perhaps the artist is citing the face and similarly lacquered hair of the African-American chanteuse Josephine Baker, who had taken the Parisian theatrical world by storm in 1925 with her seemingly primitive jazz-inspired dance routines. Kiki's face sits on its side on a table next to a dark African mask made by the Bao people of Ghana and the Ivory Coast, which she is holding upright with one hand. The direct juxtaposition of European and African versions of a woman's face in the context of the exoticism accorded l'art nègre in Paris in this period implies an interdependent equivalence between them. Indeed, we know that Man Ray experimented with a number of possible combinations of his model and the mask, in each case concerned to offer us a direct juxtaposition of her face and this figurine. In one case, he had a topless Kiki hold the mask upside down so that the mask and her face touch at the chin, as if she is looking into a mirror. When he came to make a drawing after another of these photographs, where she is holding the mask up against her cheek, Man Ray further distorted Kiki's face, elongating it, adding some texture to her hair and shading one side to make it more closely resemble the mask. The inference, once again, is that one and the other, the white and the black, the positive and the negative, are interchangeable. All this was in keeping with a popular prejudice that associated the sexual desires of women with their primitive African heritage, just as the Vogue text had indeed implied. To understand the nature of woman, the argument went, one must acknowledge the continuing influence of her evolutionary origins, hence Sigmund Freud's reference to the dark continent of female sexuality, among many other examples. Having slyly conjured this erotic subtext within what, after all, is the pages of a fashion magazine, Man Ray may well have also wanted to advance a similar argument about the necessary conjunction of black and white states of being that made his own medium possible. Indeed, it's been reported that this print was in fact made using a number of different negatives, perhaps as many as 4. The initial glass negative was projected onto a piece of film to make an enlarged and cropped reverse tone into negative. This was then extensively retouched simplifying Kiki's face, removing any stray hairs, and ensuring her eyebrows appeared as single lines. The altered image was then exposed onto yet another sheet of film, thus re-reversing the tones again and providing a negative image from which positive prints could then be made. The mutually constitutive aspect of the relationship of negatives and positives is accentuated by Man Ray's decision in this same year of 1926 to make a reversed negative print, that is, a positive print that looks like a negative, from his initial exposure, using an internegative of the kind that I've just described. By the way, it's well to remember that Man Ray himself rarely printed his own photographs, leaving that work to assistants from about 1923 onwards. Probably Berenice Abbott made this print. So, others were responsible for the actual labour that we're talking about here and for the complex production of both this negative print and the 24 positive prints of Noir et Blanche, each of them a unique object with quite distinct visual qualities, all of which were made during Man Ray's lifetime. The fact that Man Ray decided to reverse the composition as well as the tonal range suggests that positive and negative were meant to be seen together as almost exact opposites of each other, although it's not certain whether he ever exhibited them like this himself. I noticed that the curators of 2017's The Radical Eye exhibition at the Tate Modern chose to hang the two prints owned by Elton John in reverse chronological order, as if the negative print came before the positive one. By the way, they hung it in the exhibition the way he hangs it over his bed in Atlanta. This conceit is repeated in the 2017 Taschen book about Man Ray, which again chose to reproduce the two images in this same order, as if to imply that, of course, the negative always comes first. But this is the point. In this particular case, it did and it didn't. A group of negatives begat a positive, which was turned into a positive that looks like a negative, which is now treated as if it is a negative from which the positive was subsequently derived. What makes Man Ray's negative print such an uncanny object is its ability to offer up this experience of the impossible, this simultaneity in which a single photograph can be both before and after itself, can be both singular and plural, can be both one thing and its other, and therefore never quite either. His photograph offers us an oscillating encounter of one and other within itself, complicating its racist presumptions by associating any difference, including that between negative and positive, with a dynamic that is always already raced, always already sexed. To recap, most analogue photographs are dependent on a generative relationship between one thing and its other, between a negative and the positive prints made from it. In keeping with the political economies of such binary structures, although it comes first, temporally and spatially, the negative is almost always regarded by historians as a secondary entity. As with black in relation to white, or feminine to masculine, the negative is inevitably seen, if it is acknowledged at all, as a merely supplementary vehicle for the positive photographic print it generates and makes possible. This is one important reason why the negative, or more accurately the relationship of negative and positive, has attracted relatively little critical attention in histories of photography. But it's not the only reason. As we've already seen, talking about the role of the negative forces one to speak of photography's potential promiscuity and lack of singularity, of its capacity for multiple copies and therefore for mixed parentage and divided ownerships. To address the role of the negative is to destabilize any naive assumptions we might have about the purity of photography's relationship to propriety and property, ethics and ownership. And when authorship and ownership are made unstable, so too is value. This, of course, cannot be countenanced by a discourse that has always been too much in thrall to market forces. Negatives and the multiple prints made from them are the unwelcome evidence, in short, of photography's existence as a form of reproduction, of work, of commerce, and of capital. This pairing of a negative and positive ascribed to Richard Avedon is quite instructive in this context. The negative was exposed on May 9, 1981 by a team of 3 led by Avedon. This negative was in fact among 121 sheets of film exposed over a 2-day period to make this particular portrait. The portrait was in turn just one of 124 produced during a 5-year project that came to be called In the American West. All of these portrait photographs were printed at exhibition scale by Avedon's 2 studio assistants in New York, Avedon stopped printing his own work in about 1950. These assistants were each paid for their 2 years of skilled labour with a complete set of unsigned prints, made, of course, by them. The Avedon Foundation, that's the same guy now. The Avedon Foundation now refuses to authenticate these prints, making them unauthorised bastards that are unable to be sold in the marketplace and are therefore now without any monetary value. Which story do you think tells us more about the nature of photography? This one, or the one focused on the masterly formal qualities of Avedon's prints? As it happens, a discussion of the role played by the negative in Avedon's photography allows us to address both sets of issues. In the 1950s, Avedon began to draw attention to the foundational role of the negative in his work by allowing its rebate to be visible as a framing device around his prints, along with any words, Kodak safety film, that might appear in it. Sometimes Avedon would even instruct his printer to paint in a new border by hand so as to improve the composition of his image. The sign of the photograph's authenticity, these edges thereby become its most inauthentic element. In later work, the film holder plays a similar role, marking the edge of Avedon's famously confrontational portraits with a distinctively black outline. In both cases, the negative is signalled as absent but present, allowing the means of production to linger as a visible element of the photograph we now behold. Our understanding of that means, however, is held back, confined to the surface of the print, to a merely aesthetic affectation, unless one is willing to go beyond that surface and engage the complex web of technical, social, and economic forces in which photographs like these are produced and disseminated. Time is running short, and I'm still trying to persuade you that a history of photography that takes the relationship of negative and positive as its organising principle might be one worth pursuing. As I've been suggesting, a consideration of that relationship is necessarily a reflection on difference and otherness. But it also raises the issue of reproduction and its consequences, leading to a reflection on the multiplicity of identities that can be hidden in a reiteration of the same. A little history of the photographic negative is therefore not itself confined to negatives. It's a history concerned with photographic reproductions wherever they may be found. That is, with any acts of replication, emulation, copying, or repetition associated with the practice of photography. This must necessarily include a detailed examination of particular poses and genres of pose, especially those that are repeated over and over and over again. Take this pose, for instance. A shrouded figure holds a child who, despite the close proximity of this frightening ghoul, seems perfectly content. And why not? Although at first glance a potential threat, the figure's posture, compliantly allowing itself to become a seat on which the child can sit, and its rustic adornment, being cloaked by a homely blanket with decorated edges, signals that this is a parent, not a ghost. Suddenly, all becomes clear. The child's parent has become a part of the picture in order to allow the picturing itself to take place, in order to hold the child steady in front of the camera. One finds such figures lurking in the background of photographs of children surprisingly often, especially in 19th century photographs when exposure times were relatively slow. A 2013 installation by the Swedish-born Italian artist Linda Freni Nagler, titled The Hidden Mother, presented 1,000 such pictures, each of them repeating some variant of this same gesture. Here, the parents are always hidden, always effacing themselves in the interests of the legibility of the child. Nagler's installation was obviously about this effacement. He proposed that the gesture says something profound about the nature of parenting, but it also identifies this gesture with the practice of photography in general, as if to take a photograph is necessarily to enact a palimpsest, to put in motion an endless reciprocation of the visible and the invisible, of presence and absence, of negative and positive. Indeed, many of these photographs may well have been taken by a photographer crouching over a camera while covered in a dark cloth, so that, just for a moment, artist and mother exactly mimicked each other, both hiding themselves in the interests of a making visible of another. In Nagler's installation, seen here in a section of the Venice Biennale, oddly enough curated by Cindy Sherman, our examination of these kinds of reciprocation begins with a table, a tabula rasa whose blank surface has been covered by photographs. daguerreotypes, tintypes, ambrotypes, carte de visite, cabinet cards, snapshots, most of them made in the United States by now unknown photographers. They are arrayed before us like so many scientific specimens. We are thus invited to compare one to the next, noticing their common traits as well as their small distinctions. As it happens, it's also an installation comprised almost entirely of negatives. For the majority of Nagel's collected photographs are ambrotypes and tintypes. These are actually collodion negatives seen against a dark background, thus rendering them positive in appearance. In these instances, in other words, the negative is asked to act as the photograph's own hidden mother. Indeed, a close examination of this particular genre of photograph can't help but encounter many of the themes already revealed in our broader study of the negative. Notice how in some examples a mother really does hide, ducking down behind her child so that one figure is directly transposed over the other. In these pictures, the child comes before the adult, a strange reversal of their biological order. Sometimes a single hand, a kind of phantom limb, appears out of nowhere to hold the child steady. As you know, children are not steady, displaying him or her like a puppet or perhaps a ventriloquist doll. In a few examples, the supporting figure has been literally erased or covered over, sometimes just by the mat and sometimes more permanently. But in most examples, that figure is still in the picture, only covered with a piece of cloth or just pushed out to the edge, becoming a piece of living furniture that holds the child gently but firmly in place. The repetition of this procedure across 100 years of examples suggests it was widely perceived to be an effective solution to an equally widely acknowledged problem. The shrouding of a parent was a matter of convenience, part of an ongoing effort to defeat time and motion that began almost at photography's beginnings. As Daguerre himself once confessed, I quote, "The unsteadiness of the model presents, it is true, some difficulties in order for photography to succeed completely," unquote. These figures, valiantly attempting to combat this unsteadiness, replace with themselves what was once an uncomfortable iron armature dubbed a daguerreotype by cartoonists. The imposition of this armature on the body of the sitter was a way of insisting that if this sitter wanted to look lifelike in the finished photograph, they first had to pose stock still, as if dead. This was a particular problem when children were the intended subject, not only because they were notoriously reluctant to hold a pose without moving, but also because posthumous portraits of children were very common, a photographic outgrowth of the high infant mortality rate. The presence of a cloth-covered parent behind the child therefore signalled at least one important thing to any viewer: this child is actually still alive. What is the function of a portrait of a young boy or girl, as yet without identifiable physical features or personality, and lacking any distinction other than the triumph of having reached childhood itself? A portrait of such a child affirms before all else the fertility of its parents, but it's also a sign of those parents' anxiety at the possibility of loss, first of the child and then of a memory of that child. One might well say that this contradictory combination of affirmation and fear inhabits every photograph, but it's especially acute if the photograph happens to depict one's own offspring, the focal point of every dream and every nightmare a parent can muster. In other words, even though these particular parents are studiously trying to absent themselves from the picture, such pictures are really all about them. This is especially so because these shrouded figures are hiding in plain sight, made all the more visible to us today by their efforts to make themselves invisible back then. To channel the words of Jacques Derrida, they enact an erasure that allows what it obliterates to be read. The figure is there, a muffled visual presence, but he or she is not exactly seeable, or at least not identifiable. These parents have made themselves forever anonymous through a willed transfiguration from person into object. They are both there and not there, both opaque and an apparition, all at the same time. It's striking in this context that many of these figures have covered themselves in patterned blankets rather than in a black cloth, as might be expected of someone truly wanting to disappear from sight. The resulting picture therefore actively invites a flickering of our eyes back and forth between background and foreground, subject and object, immediately collapsing these distinctions along with many others. First and foremost, these pictures take for granted our ability not to see things when it suits us. This kind of looking, turning a blind eye is the vernacular expression for it, demands a suspension of disbelief on our part. We have to be prepared to enter into the spirit of the thing and act accordingly, to ignore the truth. As it happens, this is a demand in accordance with most 19th century photographs, where we are invariably asked to not notice the incongruity of fake balustrades standing on carpets or the artificiality of painted backdrops and other obvious props. Such photographs call on the viewer to exercise a heightened degree of imaginative perception, requiring us to project onto these otherwise banal pictures a quality, creativity we nowadays tend to regard as the proper province of the artist. In gifting to us this exercising of creativity, Nagler aligns her art making with a hallowed genealogy of other artistic projects that have involved the gathering of otherwise nondescript images and objects into a single meaningful archive. In such projects, the sum seen in the mind's eye of the viewer adds up to more than the individual parts, and so it is here too. In many ways, this will to archive is the preeminent artistic impulse of our time, an effort to bring order to the chaos of modern life, but also to acknowledge the systems of power that inform such ordering, whether these are manifested in that shoebox at home or in the vast algorithms of digital capitalism. In this case, the advent of internet auction sites has made it possible for Nagler to find and obtain one particular kind of photograph, isolating these from the infinity of other examples that are equally available for such plunder. In so isolating them, Nagler has created a genre of what might otherwise have just remained unconnected individual oddities. This displacement of photographs from the individual to the collective and from the private to a public realm has certain consequences. The original viewer, an intimate of the subject, probably the very parent hiding in the picture, has been replaced by us, no more than curious strangers, who now see each of these photographs as subsumed to a mass of other, very similar ones, 1,000 or more, laid out on an angled table for our convenience and delectation, and at the Venice Biennale, no less, a kind of bazaar. All this happens as a result of the work of Nagler, who thereby merges the personae of collector, curator, and artist into a single entrepreneurial figure. Like the shrouded parents and most of the photographers, and like photography itself, a medium valued above all for its self-effacement, this figure is an absent presence, responsible for the presentation of this gathering of photographs, but not for their production. That figure, of course, also happens to be a woman, surely making Nagler the ultimate subject, the hidden mother, if you like, of her own installation. Interestingly, although these supporting figures are sometimes indisputably male, they are invariably referred to as hidden mother images in vernacular circles, and even in the title of Nagler's own installation. The erasure of self that is enacted in such pictures is obviously considered to be a manifestly feminine subject position, even a specifically maternal one. We are asked to witness an act of modesty and self-effacement on the part of each of these figures, but also to examine a picture of women's place in a patriarchal society, where she is inevitably figured as without an identity of her own, a mere passage, a vehicle of reproduction, a conduit between a man and his child. She is regarded, in other words, in much the same way that the history of photography regards the negative. Ironically, in making herself invisible at the time of the photograph's initial exposure, a hidden mother makes the inequity of her subject position all the more visible to us today, and therefore available for our recognition and critique. But this dynamic, in which suppression and propulsion are equally manifest, also points to her place in each viewer's unconscious. As psychoanalysis would have it, the mother is the original object of desire, always to be repressed and replaced by substitutes who stand in for what we really want, a reunion with the mother figure of our dreams. In this fashion, a hidden mother continually haunts the economy of our desires, a homemade phantom who can never be acknowledged except surreptitiously through inadequate proxies. But what does she want, this hidden mother? How does she see the world and her role in it from the other side of her self-imposed shroud? All portraits of a mother holding her offspring recall, sometimes even consciously, the Christian iconography of Madonna and Child, the ideal emblem of maternal performance. Think, for example, of Raphael's theatrical painting of a Sistine Madonna, where the baby Jesus is tenderly cradled in the voluminous robes of his unnaturally serene mother, simultaneously celebrating a birth that has only recently occurred and a redemptive death that is still to come. According to Hegel, love of the kind represented here is an emotion in which one finds oneself, fulfills one's own potentialities, precisely because it involves totally sacrificing oneself for another human being. Showing us love in its perfect form, as a power that can hold life and death in suspension, Raphael's composition therefore proposes the possibility of a divine presence in humanity in general. In photographs of children in which parents have placed themselves in the picture, even while visibly erasing their own presence, we are asked to witness that same sacrifice and that same desire for a divine fulfillment. Witness it and perhaps aspire to achieve the same. Nagel's installation dared to bring these very ordinary photographs, along with their quite extraordinary aspirations, into the space of the avant-garde, complicating our normal expectations of both. In this aspect, as in so many others, the hidden mother asked us to enter a dizzying oscillation of opposites, as if it is only within the disconcerting experience offered by such a maelstrom that we can at last come out of hiding and truly find ourselves. One could well say the same about the history of photography as a critical discourse. My talk this evening has tried to follow Nagel's lead and that of the other artists whose work I've been showing you, in closely attending to the various political economies within which photographs are produced, disseminated, and consumed. This attention necessarily began with the binary opposition of negative and positive, the opposition that current histories refuse to acknowledge or discuss. Steeped in pejorative language and metaphysical prejudice, the negative is feared as the source of photography's reproducibility and therefore of its potential for promiscuity and impurity. But this is precisely its fascination. As we've seen, a study of the negative is an engagement with multiplicity and complexity, with repetitions and the differences they generate, with the potency of otherness, and with photography as a mode of work and of commerce. Tonight, I've set out to offer you a little history of the negative that touches on all of these things, if only to demonstrate the potential fecundity of this approach. I hope you will now let me know where I've gone wrong. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jeff. Funnily enough, I suspect that people won't be queuing up to tell you where you've gone wrong, but they will.
It's always good to do it before publication.
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Could be helpful. But I'm sure there are many here who have thoughts and questions. Could I ask two things? That you keep your question or intervention brief, and that you wait until a microphone arrives with you, and that you speak as close to it as I'm speaking to this one, so that we can hear your question. Thank you. Put a hand up and I'll ask someone.
I know names, and so people will be called upon.
Yeah.
Yes,
if there's no volunteers, we're going to be choosing. Yes, there's a question here, two along for you.
Thank you so much for your talk. My question is, you mentioned along the way the darkroom, and I wondered why a history of the negative and not a history of the darkroom, or perhaps that's the next book coming up.
There are so many books. I mean, it's interesting how the darkroom so rarely appears in histories or indeed even discussions of photography. Indeed, the production of the photograph is something that's rarely commented on or discussed. A longer version of this gives you all sorts of statistics. For example, the best survey history of photography, Michel Frisot's A New History of Photography, which has over 1,000 illustrations, has just 9 negatives illustrated, all of them from the first couple of years of photography's existence. And never is a negative shown with a positive, and never are multiple prints shown, and thus the role of the negative is completely erased. But equally, one could say that the darkroom is barely mentioned either, and yet for most of photography's history, that has been the site of production. So even trying to find, say, a history of the enlarger, which you would have thought is one of the most crucial elements of photographic making, it's really hard to find information about the history of enlargers and when they became, central parts of the photographic process and all of this kind of thing. So looking at the negative, and this is just a survey, of course, which is I'm hoping is going to open up all sorts of threads that other people better informed than I will be able to pursue, including the one you're going to write on the darkroom. Helen Ennis has a question.
We have a question from Helen, and I can reach you with this one. Probably just.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff. Fascinating as always. Look, my question really is going to start with a comment about the different material properties between, obviously, the negatives that we know from film and then the prints, because the negative is actually very resistant to human touch. So there's not the kind of covetousness that's possible when you're looking at a negative as there is with a print, because you can hold a print, you have a different kind of relationship. So, you know, even that slide you showed where one person has their fingers across a negative and you think, oh no, don't do that because you'll ruin the negative.
Yeah.
Would you just like to expound a little bit on that different materialism?
Well, as you well know, Helen, having been a veteran of this business that we're in, for many, many years, negatives were just not part of the marketplace. But it's interesting, in the last maybe 10 years or 15 years, 19th century paper negatives are now very desirable. Sugimoto is the biggest private collector of Talbot negatives, for example. He owns, I think, 25 of them or 35 of them, something like that. So there are now dealers who sell 19th century negatives and collectors who avidly collect them and spend a lot of money on them because, of course, they are absolutely unique. A Talbot negative is unique, where he often printed sometimes hundreds of positives from that negative. It's more difficult in the case of celluloid film negatives. They have all sorts of issues, conservation issues. Isabel's nodding. The Art Gallery doesn't collect them as part of its photographs collection. I suspect the NGA doesn't either. Although they often appear now in archives or libraries. National libraries often is where the negatives end up. And so, yeah, they're less valued in the marketplace. But what I'm interested in, for example, and in terms of our respective interests in curating, is how rarely the negative and its consequences, let's say the multiple production of prints from a single matrix, is ever evidenced in an exhibition or acknowledged or reflected on or discussed. And there are many ways in which even celluloid negatives can be made visible as part of the process of the production of what we're looking at without you having to actually handle or look at a negative. Multiple prints, for example, contact sheets. I have a whole chapter on contact sheets in this upcoming book. Things like that. There are ways in which we could, as curators, exhibit the role of the negative visibly for an audience and help them understand some of these technical complexities that photographers, of course, well understand, but I suspect most lay people, especially those that are born of a generation of iPhones and digital cameras, are not that familiar with and don't really quite understand. So hopefully a project like this will prompt not only historians but curators to start rethinking how they might actually reflect on this part of that history. Donna.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, as usual, beautiful presentation and really stimulating a lot of thoughts already. So I'm interested in, I suppose, what happens to negatives that we never get to see, including, as you've made quite clear, those that are discarded. So the ones that are thought to be not good enough, for instance. So Dorothea Lange, in some of her photographs that are in the archive in, I think it's New York Public Library or the LOC.
Most of her negatives would have gone to the Library of Congress
Library
when
of
she
Congress,
was employed
right.
by
Yes,
the government.
yeah, the
but of course
LOC,
she had a long career as a
exactly,
commercial photographer.
Yeah. So it's really interesting, the ones that she discarded or chose not to print.
Well, that's the sort of thing you can see in contact prints.
That's right.
I mean, when you think that Robert Frank exposed 27,000 negatives to make the 83 prints that ended up in the Americans, the contact prints where you see him having to make decisions, both which one out of the exposures and how he's going to crop that particular exposure. I mean, it's kind of a fascinating study to see an artist actually thinking these things, and what you begin to realize about, say, a Frank is it's the editing that was the art of the project, not really the shooting, because he had 27,000, you might say he had about 26,500 mistakes, and then he chose the 83 that he thought were not mistakes. And that process must have been, a laborious creative activity in its own right. So, but I'm not sure what your question is. I'm just intervening as you go. But I'm just saying contact sheets can tell us something of this story, even when the negative itself is lost. Strangely, the contact sheet often outlives negatives of that sort.
Well,
Yeah.
exactly. And that's the interesting other part of it, I suppose, is in terms of thinking about vernacular photography, which you also write about, in terms of what you find in junk shops and various other things. It's very rarely is it actually negatives. So it's interesting the kind of value, even in terms of family photographs, that people apply to the negative, and is it really interesting to think about where they actually go.
Yeah.
But so I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the book, because I'm sure you're going to be covering some
I'll
of these
have to add
things.
something about that now.
No, it's just fascinating, and also the archives that we work in. Like I've been in the Stasi archive recently and try to get copies of the images. They often erase the fact that it's a negative that you've been looking at originally. That's the only copy they actually have.
Yeah.
So it struck me as, again, this idea of, you actually don't know what you're really looking at.
I'll give you another example of the repression of the negative. As I mentioned, the Library of Congress got all of the Farm Security Administration photographs, over 1.5 million of them, and all the negatives. But if you look up negative in the Library of Congress database, what you get are positive digital impressions of the negatives. They never actually reproduce the negative as negative anywhere in the archive. Negatives don't exist, except in their apparitional form as positives.
I'm from the State Library of New South Wales, so we, of course, have just acquired over 200,000 of Max Dupaine's negatives.
Yes.
And that is exactly what you do see through that archive, the decisions that he made, which of the series, have become that iconic,
Can I
famous
ask
image.
what you're going to do with them? I mean,
They're
what
all
does one do with them?
digitised. They're all being digitised.
As negatives or as positive clips?
Well, they're digitised negative, and then so we have it as the negative, and then for display for so people can see the image. It will be displayed on the catalogue record in positive form, but they are all digitised as negative.
But we're not going to show them as negatives.
We
on
could
that
do.
form?
There's no reason not to. And
There's a lot of reasons to do it.
And there's absolutely no. We have done same with the Tribune archive.
Yeah.
We did the instance of, you said, where we digitised the entire strip, so you can see the film, the brand. You can see the number on the reel.
And perhaps you could explain to audience members who don't understand. I presume the library has some sort of cold storage facility where negatives
yes.
can be kept in
Film,
relatively constant.
Film negatives are stored in the freezer.
I
Yes,
know
that's
that in
correct.
the National Library in Wellington, where I live, you go underground, and Isabel and I have done it together, and you go through all of these stages, and in the last stage, which is where they keep the nitrate film stock, you have to wear Antarctic
correct.
gear to go in because
That's
it's
right.
like sub-zero.
And you can only be in there for a few minutes at a time.
Yeah,
It's
it's bloody freezing.
quite extraordinary
Yeah, it
trying to
is.
retrieve
So do you have
items.
that kind of facility?
We do,
Oh, yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned about, the editorial process. We also have some of Helmut Newton's photographs taken of Maggie Tabra for the early issues of Australian Vogue. And what is interesting there is both the negs and the proof sheets, and he has scored through and defaced so that it's clear which is the image that he wishes to be used.
On the negative itself?
On
or
the
on
negative
contact
and
sheet?
on the contact
can
sheet.
have a
And
print
he
from
did
it.
that deliberately because he didn't want the Vogue editors to have the final decision.
Right.
He would pick which one he felt was the right image to be used and deface the rest. So
Yeah. Scored negatives, that's another thing I could add. It'd be nice.
it's quite good to see.
Yeah. It's going to become a very big book.
The little history of the negative.
Yeah.
I was just going to follow up as well with also from the State Library, but obviously we see a lot of negatives. I was wondering if you had any comments about the reproduction of negatives. So reproduction of negatives as negatives and reproduction of negatives as positives. I think you mentioned some of it, but certainly we come across in a lot of instances, if not most instances, of negatives having been worked on before being printed.
Yeah.
So what the notion of an original negative or people putting extra added information onto that negative after the development of it is something we come across. Is that something you also covering in your book?
Well, I tried to show you quite a few examples, or a few selected examples of that kind of work, and as I suggested at the beginning of my talk, you could give lectures that would take several hours discussing those kinds of manipulations. But I show them in a sense to suggest to you that every negative almost invariably is manipulated in some way, even if only in the process of its actual development. But historically, there's almost no photographer no canonical photographer that did not manipulate their negatives, including Edward Weston, to take an example. The great purist, in fact, manipulated his negatives, enhanced them, had all sorts of tricks in the darkroom, if necessary, applied ink to them. But almost everybody does. So we should start from the presumption that every negative is also a hand-worked object, not some sort of pure index.
Okay, we may have room for space for a couple of questions before we move to the next fun phase of the
There's one at the back.
There's one at the back, and then I'll come to one at the front.
Another
at the
archivist,
end.
I suspect.
I think maybe if someone could do a sort of
relay.
Mexican pass or whatever it is.
What's that?
Thanks. Just to go back to the idea of the rejected image, because I work at the Art Gallery of New South Wales archive, and we've got hundreds and thousands of negatives, particularly from Robert Walker and Jennifer Humphreys and photographers like that. And when you go through, we have a rejected Lloyd Rees series from Vogue, which fortunately he didn't obliterate, because when we went through looking for a photograph on the back cover of Hendrik Collingberg's book on Lloyd Rees, one of the rejected images absolutely stood out from the rest, but it would have just sat there on the contact sheet, but digitally to be able to blow it up and say, no, that's the photo we want. So, the negative can be saved to that point and not obliterated. It can sometimes come back from the dead in that way.
They're always alive. A number of photographers that I quote in the book say things like, my negatives are alive, just like me and you, and they have all of these afterlives. And Lange often talked about how her negatives have had all these unexpected afterlives.
Geoffrey,
Ross.
you showed an example of an artist, I can't think of their name, that kind of blurred the lines between being a curator and being an artist.
Linda Nagler, the final one.
And my question to you is, can we expect in the future to see artist Batchen rather than curator Batchen?
Well,
and if that was the case, would you be going to the dark side or the light side?
I always prefer the dark side if I can go there. This opens up a much bigger discussion about the practice of curating. Just for those who, on the peripheries of it, there's an argument that says a curator should be simply a facilitator of the artists that they show or of the work that they show, that the curator should remain as invisible to that work as is humanly possible. Whereas I am indeed that's the light side. I'm on the dark side. I see curating as an inevitably interventionist practice, and therefore I make my intervention as plain as possible. So my exhibitions are not quite as over the top as Nagler's, but they're somewhat similar in that my hand is very evident, and the installation itself is sort of not expected and things like that. I would never pretend to call myself an artist, though.
I think that we may be at the... Okay, come on. Make it brief.
Jennifer Preston, the final word.
I was just wondering if all this not talking about the darkroom and not talking about the enlarger and not talking about the negative has something to do with the magician not giving away the trick. In that, okay, now we kind of all pretty much know how a photograph is made, but there was a time when it was a little piece of magic and no one knew, and I'm wondering if that's the reason that from the beginning of the history no one talked about it.
Okay.
Comment?
Yes, no comment. What's interesting, Jen, is that historically a lot of photographers have been very happy to talk about it. Henry Peach Robinson wrote article after article about exactly how he made his combination prints. So did Oscar Raylander in the 19th century. As I showed you, Richard Avedon makes plain, in all sorts of ways, the role and fact of his negatives. I don't think photographers have been reticent about it, but historians have barely discussed it. It's very hard to find anything about negatives in histories of photography. As I say, they're barely reproduced, they're almost never discussed. So it's not photographers that in other words, I think what you're saying is, are photographers sort of repressing something of it because they want to keep the magical? In my experience, photographers are quite happy to talk about it, and any photographer knows this is the nature of the medium. It's about this manipulation between negative and positive and so on. But historians, for some reason, and I tried to give some of the reasons, apart from racism and sexism, there's just the question of the value of photographs. And that value becomes more unstable and potentially diminishes if, for example, we constantly reiterate, well, this rare print that someone's spending $1 million on is actually one of at least 24 and possibly many more, perhaps even one of hundreds. The market doesn't like that talk. And so generally speaking, historians of photography follow in the footsteps of the market, and they have not discussed it. The labour of photography is rarely discussed. So I think photographers are quite happy to talk about it, and historically have certainly published many articles about what they do with negatives. But historians and curators are more reluctant. I hope for not much longer.
I think on that note, we should, first of all, I mean, you know, I'm slightly wistful at just what it is we're going to be missing in this part of the world as you travel to the dark side in Oxford.
It's getting darker all the time.
It's getting darker all the time, yeah. But I just want to say it's so wonderful to hear you speak, Jeff. That was a beautiful lecture as well as incredibly powerful and informative one. But I also want, the evening is not yet done. First of all, because you're all going to buy this book so that Jeff can sign them all night, but also because we are all going to prepare to properly celebrate both the launch of this book and the presence that you are and continue to be in this region as elsewhere, even after we lose you to Oxford. Thank you very much, Jeff, and we'll continue on.
Thank you for your introduction.